Looking for a home that keeps you connected to Silicon Valley without the usual barriers to entry? The Gates in Morgan Hill by City Ventures is a walkable neighborhood near downtown restaurants, outdoor trails, and an easy commute to the Bay Area. It's a small town setting with access to major career hubs. Every home is all electric with buyer-owned solar included. With limited availability, now's the time to take a closer look. Discover your new home at cityventures.com. That's cityventures.com.
Coming up on the Threat Status Podcast, we talk to Scott Davis, the former Program Executive Officer for Ground Combat Systems with the U.S. Army, about the future of ground vehicles in 21st century combat, what role tanks will play in future wars, and much more. And then we break down the latest escalation of the Iran war and more questions about the Pentagon's defense industry investment strategy. Don't forget to go to WashingtonTimes.com and sign up for the daily Threat Status newsletter. Hello and welcome to the Threat Status Podcast. I'm your host, Ben Wolfgang, national security correspondent at the Washington Times, and I'm joined as always by my esteemed co-host, Guy Taylor, the national security editor here at the Times. Really good interview this week on a subject we actually haven't talked too much about recently here on the show, and that's Army ground combat systems and their future. So tanks, Bradleys, autonomy, how vehicles can defend themselves from attack drones, what we've learned from the Russia-Ukraine war, questions about the industrial base's ability to build those vehicles, and a lot more. So stay tuned for that coming up in just a few minutes with Scott Davis. But before we get there, Guy, first things first, as always, what's on your radar right now?
Hi, Ben. It's great to be here for another week. I'm tracking the moment-to-moment of how the U.S. Iran war has escalated anew in recent days, with American and Saudi Arabian military forces carrying out joint airstrikes on Tehran-backed militias in Iraq, while Iran's military carried out a major surprise ballistic missile attack on July 28, targeting a U.S. military installation in Jordan. The Jordanian military was able to intercept the incoming Iranian missiles, but the developments have just underscored how widely this war has escalated and spread, and how far away we are now from a coherent diplomatic process to end this thing. Critics of the Trump administration will say this whole situation is a diplomatic failure of top administration officials, J.D. Vance, Marco Rubio, Jared Kushner, others at this point. Of course, backers of President Trump will counter with the observation that Iran's militant proxies are beaten down in Lebanon, meaning Hezbollah, and now with Saudi involvement, Iran's proxies in Iraq and potentially the Houthis in Yemen are going to be hammered as this conflict churns violently forward. We're tracking it every day in the Threat Status newsletter.
You know, Guy, it reminds me of the conversation we had last week with Congressman Pat Harrigan, where he sort of raised this idea, without explicitly endorsing it, but raised this idea of should President Trump just essentially declare victory and pull U.S. troops out and end this war. And I got into that in a piece in the Washington Times this week and talked to some other sources about that very question. And I was a little bit surprised by the fact that it seemed like there was, for the most part, agreement that that might be the best course of action, and then it wouldn't actually do any long-term damage to U.S. credibility in the region, at least not any more than we've already done with getting into this war without what seems to be a clear plan to get out of it. So there's a couple reasons why this might be a good idea. We're apparently running low on targets to actually strike in Iran militarily, and our munition stockpiles and those of our allies are running low. So there is this question, I think, starting to hang over this entire thing, Guy, that, you know, maybe at a certain point you take stock of what we've done, destroyed their Navy, destroyed their ballistic missile and drone production, if not their stockpiles, set their nuclear program back, and killed a ton of IRGC leaders. Maybe that's enough to declare victory, but who knows?
Well, one reason declaring victory and getting out at this point is so difficult, Ben, is that there's a renewed narrative right now that the Mideast war is increasingly entangled with the Russian war in Ukraine. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky pushed that narrative while visiting President Trump at the White House in recent days. He was in Washington for Lindsey Graham's funeral the same day that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was at the White House. The Ukrainian military carried out a successful drone strike on an Iranian-flagged cargo ship that Kyiv says was transiting weapons components from Russia to Iran on July 25. And that has really underscored this narrative of convergence between the most active wars raging on the world stage right now. The Iranian government, which has for years at this point been supporting Russia's invasion of Ukraine in exchange for strategic backing from Moscow, has threatened to carry out direct counterstrikes against Ukrainian targets. We're obviously watching that closely. All the while, Ben, Zelensky has made headlines by claiming that Ukrainian intelligence has recorded active Russian satellite surveillance over the Middle East that Moscow has provided to Tehran to help Iranian forces more accurately monitor and target American assets in the region. The idea of a global conflict or World War-style convergence here is also undergirded by news in recent days that North Korea, the only military treaty ally of China, by the way, has plans to send 30,000 more of its own troops to support Russia's ongoing assault on Ukraine. Of course, the North Koreans are emboldened at this point amid reports, actually threat status. His own Andrew Salmon, who's based in Northeast Asia, he's actually the Washington Times Asia editor, did an article in recent days about how North Korea is shifting toward a so-called nuclear triad of ground, sea, and air-based nuclear weapons, a reality that finds Pyongyang protected from the kind of military assault that the U.S. and its allies have been carrying out against the authoritarian theocratic regime that's ruling Iran, which, by the way, does not have a nuclear weapon.
The conflict's escalating on a number of fronts, and you wonder what that's going to mean for the Trump administration and its calculus going forward. Guy, I did some more reporting this week on a subject that's become a mainstay on this show over the past month or so, and that's the Pentagon's equity stakes, financial stakes in defense and critical minerals companies. And I frankly had a little bit of a frustrating back and forth with some Pentagon officials on the subject, and I wanted to bring it up to give listeners a little bit of insight into why this is such an important issue to me right now, because it's all a little bit mysterious. For starters, I've said a few times on this show that the Office of Strategic Capital is driving the bus on these financial stakes. The Pentagon tells me they're actually not, at least not right now. Right now, OSC is just giving loans, and the equity stakes, the actual financial ownership stakes, are coming from other parts of the Pentagon. If that sounds confusing, I feel the same way, because the Senate defense spending bill would explicitly give the Office of Strategic Capital the power to handle those equity stakes. So the Pentagon's doing it anyway. And there's this National Security Fund Finance Program, which is the idea of giving loans to investment fund managers who will then invest in defense industrial-based companies and critical minerals.
I'm sorry. This is one of these moments with the Threat Status podcast. And I remember when we made the promotion for the podcast several years ago at this point, we told listeners we were going to bring you inside, behind the scenes, inside the reporting process. You've just outlined a story that I would assign, and we're talking about it publicly now on the podcast. So hopefully we're gonna have. So what did he say? What did they say?
We were curious on this show, Guy, and you brought up a few weeks ago whether profiteering could come into the mix here if people get in the middle of this process. So I asked the plan to avoid that, specifically to avoid wasted taxpayer money and fraud. And I asked about the vetting process. This is what I was told when I asked specifically whether there were, number one, fears of fraud, and number two, fears that this would disadvantage companies that aren't getting government money and aren't in bed with the Pentagon financially. They said, quote, before any loan is dispersed, OSC, the Office of Strategic Capital, conducts extensive due diligence on potential borrowers to fulfill all necessary conditions. To protect the integrity of this process and the proprietary information of potential borrowers, the department cannot comment on the specific commercial, contractual, financial, technical, or legal considerations raised during the conditional loan commitment process, unquote. So I'd love to know more about this framework. And we're going to try to get someone from OSC or from the Secretary of Defense's office to come on the show and explain all of this to me, because as Congressman Harrigan said last week on this podcast, there are alarm bells starting to go off about this entire investment strategy because of how mysterious it is and potentially how sort of sweeping it might be in terms of helping to reshape the defense industrial base in real time. And we are joined now by Scott Davis, the president of the National Defense Industrial Association's Michigan chapter. Scott was formerly the program executive officer for ground combat systems with the Army, in addition to other high-profile roles with the Army. And Scott, you were vice president of ground vehicles and vice president of programs and technology at BAE Systems. You're technically retired now, I believe. So congratulations on that. And thank you for coming on the Threat Status Podcast.
Thank you, Ben. I appreciate the opportunity and look forward to having a discussion around ground systems, which, are always a challenge as we think about the readiness of our combat forces.
Absolutely, and very much in the news these days as well, as I know we'll get into as we go along here. But I'm curious, kind of, zooming out to the 30,000 foot perspective, as we often say here on the show. You worked on both sides of the coin here, in the Army and then, of course, in industry. So we'll get into detail about ground vehicles as we go along here. But broadly speaking, what's the biggest change when you make that switch? I'm always curious to hear about the transition sort of back and forth between those two worlds, because it happens all the time. It's kind of a staple of the U.S. defense industrial system. So for somebody who did it and who lived it, what are the biggest differences when you make that change?
Well, I think that's a question I get asked a lot, and I still come back and offer instruction and guest lectures at what was Defense Acquisition University and other things. But I think when I was in the PEO role, there were a number of things which I thought I was pretty good at in terms of understanding industry and what made them tick and what was important to them. But I think going over on the industry side, I found out that I really didn't know as much as I thought I knew. And really just a bunch of hardworking folks tried to do essentially the same thing that the Army folks are trying to do. And so I think that was refreshing to me. Post-COVID, the other big challenge was we had suppliers that to BAE that were solid for decades, literally, always on time deliveries, always top quality. And I think the labor pool, the skilled labor pool, greatly diminished through COVID and post-COVID. And so we were seeing things that we hadn't seen from these suppliers, delays and quality challenges, those sorts of things.
Yeah, that's interesting. I've heard that from folks in sort of other corners of the defense industry as well, that there is a pre-COVID and post-COVID when it comes to supply chains and workforce and all that stuff. It's interesting. Let me ask you this question, because I'm curious whether you think sort of armor, ground vehicles, ground systems are becoming, I hesitate to say afterthoughts, but whether they're kind of getting lost in the shuffle, so to speak, with so much attention on AI, of course, aerial drones, sea drones, undersea drones, autonomy. There are significant investments, of course, in ground vehicles in the defense spending bills currently making their way through Congress. But I'm curious, it doesn't seem to me sometimes like there's as much energy or excitement behind those, at least on Capitol Hill, as there is with other capabilities.
Yeah, I think what you're making is a great point. So, as I saw really from the FY25 budget through 26 and now 27, there was a shift, and it's not unexpected and probably not unreasonable, where money got shifted a lot to air, space, maritime, and ground vehicles. Largely, the tactical wheeled vehicles took the biggest hits, but even the combat vehicles took some significant hits. Even though it's reasonable, you can't or you shouldn't reduce those platforms to below their minimum sustaining rate in production, because if you do, those are the things that are bringing the supply base along, and that same supply base are the providers for all your spare parts, which are the supporting the vehicles that are still in the field. And then I think if you go below the minimum sustaining rate and you lose that supply base, they go to other product lines or commercial or wherever, it takes a very long time to get them back. And so I always ask people the question, how confident are you that we're not going to get into a ground war someplace in the world in the next 5 years where we'll need spare parts, where we'll need replacement vehicles? Because I would tell you that in some cases where they've zeroed the budget entirely on programs, it'll be a difficult time bringing those back if that happens.
Yeah, I want to come back to that idea of sort of production capacity and what the industrial base would be able to produce a little bit later, because that's such a key point on ground systems and more broadly for the defense industry. But I'm curious to zero in on tanks specifically for a second, because as you well know, there were some obituaries written for tanks during the Russia-Ukraine war, and specifically when you look at M1A1 Abrams. Some estimates show that nearly 90% of what we've given to Ukraine have been damaged or destroyed by the Russians. What's your read on where we are, sort of broadly speaking, with the tank right now, how it fared in the Russia-Ukraine war, and sort of how it's viewed as a part of 21st century combat going forward?
Well, I think, tanks are really important, but, they fight as a combined arms team. And, I always tell people, I said, the Army indeed has some of the best equipment in the world, but the real difference for our Army comes from the training of our soldiers and the ability to conduct multi-domain operations, right? So that is just the training and the way we fight is different, perhaps, than Ukraine might use them if they were given them in a situation like their conflict. And when I had thought about that question, I did take a look, and there's a Ukraine armored warfare specialist that made a quote, and he stressed that the poor use of the vehicles, including operations focused on boosting morale, has been an important contributor to the loss of the tanks in Ukraine. And so, I like to go back, and if everybody's talking all about drones, this isn't our first game here. So as you recall, back in Iraq, we started, but then started to encounter IEDs, which were a new thing. And, again, everybody's like, well, does that mean, the vehicles are no good? And the immediate reaction is to how do I protect it with the blast? But we quickly learned that you have to get what they called left of the boom, right? So you had to go find the target and placers and take them out. Then you had to go find the makers, take that out, and the material sources and take those out, and the funders. And I would argue the same is the way U.S. would address a UAV threat, is that you wouldn't just try to figure out how to shoot them down, although that is an important component in future combat vehicles, where I think you're going to have some combination of kinetic defense, you're going to have some directed energy defense, and probably some RF-based defense against drones and drone swarms.
Well, Scott, that's a great segue, because I wanted to ask you sort of what, when we're thinking about whether it's tanks or any other type of armored vehicles, what they need to be able to do today in the 21st century. Like you just mentioned a couple of those specific capabilities to deal with drones and other things. Where is sort of the mindset, both, I guess, in industry as well, and kind of designing the future, the next wave of ground systems to deal with all of these cutting edge high tech threats that we see now?
Yeah, so I think, you just hit on another great topic, because, coming from a combat vehicle OEM, whether it's BAE Systems or GD, they outsource roughly 70% of the vehicle's content, and quite frankly, can come from anybody. And I think now with this push to see some more commercial innovation, those are fantastic things. But I think what those OEMs and what the Army needs to drive towards is really a modular open system architecture in these systems. So I now basically create a computing infrastructure in the vehicle that allows you to plug and play new sensors, new effectors, new things onto those platforms, and even to the degree that it can host, AI enabled things and autonomy things that can unburden the crew and allow them to be more strategic in the way they're fighting the vehicle. And the real mundane things of driving it and watching out for targets can largely be done autonomously for them. And so I do think those are key. There's big advances in active protection, enhanced sensors, which is big, and it'll continue to grow. Not only the types and variations, but now with the compute and AI, can they fuse those sensors, and can they use AI to interpret changes and threats and things autonomously for the crew? I think electrification's a big thing because all these things require more power. got to maintain, high speed mobility and longer range versatile weapons. But the other thing that I saw as I was leaving is, we always used to say if it was active protection, I wanted to put it on every platform. And I think now, we know those platforms fight in formation. So if you have now a pervasive network that includes that formation, you only have to put it on a couple of the systems and they can protect the others. The same is true with target engagement. Not every vehicle has to go engage the target. One can see it and another one can shoot it.
Scott, you mentioned modular, and I'm glad you did because I asked this question to Justin Finelli, the CTO of the Navy, recently with respect to how this applied to ships. But I think a lot of the same points can apply to ground systems as well, and that's how much of that can you do before you need an entirely new vehicle? Sort of where is the limit to how much new stuff you can sort of retrofit or include onto an existing ground system before it becomes overloaded, too heavy, it's too complicated, too hard to maintain? How do you sort of make that cost benefit analysis when you're thinking about modular capabilities here?
Yeah, so I mean, I have also said to the argument that, both Bradley and Abrams are over 4 decades old, but the version that we fight is way different than the one the Ukrainians fight, but it is like night and day difference between where they started, right? In terms of sensing, in terms of weapons, in terms of compute and all the operations. And so I think largely when you think of a combat vehicle, that base, if you do the chassis structure and you design it for growth, the suspension, the powertrain, those don't change very rapidly. But I would tell you that I've seen new sensors, new weapons, new ammo handling systems, active protection, all those things come in a more rapid pace. And so I think when I talk about the modularity, yes, you have to build in growth in the base platform so that it doesn't get overweight. But it's really the computer analogy where I can bring a printer to my computer and I can plug it in. It knows it's a printer, it loads the drivers, and now it's operational. And that's where we got to get to. Because if you really want to turn and address emerging threats, there's a lot of stuff out there. We need to be aware of it, but it also needs to be able to be integrated and run on the system with very little, extra work.
You mentioned autonomy. I'm hoping you can maybe kind of help our audience wrap our heads around how autonomy relates to ground systems specifically, because we talk on the show a lot about aerial drones and sea drones, increasingly undersea drones. What does that look like with ground vehicles? Are we talking about like actual tanks or Bradleys with no human beings inside, or is there something in between? What exactly do we mean when we talk about autonomy with respect to ground system?
Yeah, so I think, I won't say that it will never get to full autonomy, but I'll tell you the ground domain is the hardest challenge there is in autonomy. And I always kid and say, how do you stop an autonomous vehicle? You just walk out in front of it, right? And so, that is a challenge that certainly doesn't suit itself for a combat platform. But if you think more in terms of the GM Super Cruise or the Tesla self-drive, those kinds of things I think will add great value to them because now it allows the driver to be another set of eyes, and he doesn't have to focus exclusively on the driving task. He's there, he's watching, but the system can take that over. And I think that's really where autonomy in the ground vehicle space is going to be. The other, and if you go to the tactical vehicle side, I think the other one that's where autonomy is going to come into play is this leader follower technology, where you have a vehicle in the formation or a couple that actually have human beings in them that are, supervising, but you can have a whole train of vehicles behind you that are simply following and keeping up with you. So you're not exposing as many folks to threats as you're moving supplies or fuel or water or those kinds of things.
Scott, last question here in the few minutes that we have left. And we touched on this a little bit at the beginning, and we probably could spend an entire 15, 20 minutes on this subject alone, but we'll try to cover it in 3 or 4. What is the current capacity or capability right now, as you see it, of the U.S. defense industry to produce ground vehicles at a large scale quickly, if we need to? You mentioned earlier, are we all sure that we're not going to end up in a major ground war at some point in the future? God forbid, but we might. So if we needed to double or triple production of armored multi-purpose vehicles or mechanized infantry combat vehicles eventually, are we going to be able to do that? Or will, these same production capacity bottlenecks that we talk about on this show all the time, that are all across the defense industry, whether it's, solid rocket motors or rare earth elements, all those different things that seem to be keeping us from getting where we want to go manufacturing wise. Does that apply to ground systems as well? Are we seeing some of those same bottlenecks that could potentially become a problem if we had to ramp up quickly in a crisis situation?
Yeah, so I think, we've proven it on the tactical vehicle side because there is a higher degree of commonality with our Army tactical vehicles to commercial trucks. Obviously differences, but I think if you needed to rapidly ramp up, and we proved it with MRAP, tactical vehicles, it's quite a bit easier. On the combat vehicle side, they're pretty capital intensive in terms of, being able to build those large hulls and powertrains and things. And so they're a little bit more difficult to ramp up. And I think, when I was in the PEO role, it was always a challenge to say, how much can the U.S. budget afford to buy in terms of new things? And that was much less than what you would say if I was in a wartime scenario. And so you got to strike a balance that says, how do I set the capital that builds combat vehicles to a level that can be sustained with the money we have and has some marginal ramp that can be energized if we need more platforms. But on the combat vehicle side, it's much more difficult. And I don't know if you've heard it or read it, but there's a book called Freedom's Forge by Dr. Arthur Herman. And it was striking to me because I was listening to it not too long ago as an audiobook. And when you get to chapter 4, the challenges that the U.S. and really the Allies were facing in that time between World War I and World War II, they had totally gutted the production capacity of military equipment. And it was a huge thing. But I would tell you, if you look at what Bill Knudsen and Henry Kaiser did to help Roosevelt re-energize that defense industrial base, it took a ton of patriotism and everybody getting along to make that happen. And I'm wondering if we could do that today.
Well, Scott's a great question. In the few 30, 45 seconds we have left, you're in Michigan. So, of course, that was kind of ground zero for when we did this during the World War II era. Sitting where you're sitting in Michigan right now, do you think we could mobilize in that same way if we needed to?
I think we could eventually, but I think it would take longer. I'm just amazed at how fast they turned Chrysler into building a tank plant and kicking tanks out. They built 60,000 tanks in that whole period of World War II. So I think it's possible. I just think it would be a bigger challenge, and there's probably some more planning that needs to be done strategically on what do we need and how do we at least keep it more viable so that it reduces the lead time if we did have to turn the crank and produce more.
Okay, great. Scott Davis, thank you so much for coming on the Threat Status Podcast.
Well, thank you.
And it's time now for Threat of the Week, our weekly segment here on the show where we each identify a threat, whether it's here at home domestically or in some corner of the world that we think is impacting U.S. national security right now. This week, as you listen to the show, Guy, what do you have as your threat of the week?
My threat of the week is that the world in August of 2026 is teetering on the edge of world war. That in fact, there is a dangerous convergence between the Iran and Ukraine conflicts, and the drawing in of Saudi Arabia to this new escalation in the Middle East only adds to this feeling of a global conflict. My threat is that there's not enough talk of peace and ending these wars right now. How far we've come from the start of the Trump administration when President Trump vowed to end the Ukraine war in a matter of days. The current situation is dangerous. My threat is that it may turn worse without a serious call by world leaders. It could be President Trump and Chinese President Xi Jinping for peace. It's something I predict will be an undergirding theme at the UN General Assembly gathering of world leaders in New York City in September.
Well, my thread of the week is kind of related to these broadening conflicts, and specifically the idea of data centers being targeted in the war. Our colleague Vaughn Cockayne wrote about these newly released satellite images that appear to confirm Iran's claim that it struck 2 Amazon Web Services data centers in Bahrain earlier this month. Bloomberg first reviewed those satellite images and reported on them. This has happened a few times now. Back in March, Iranian drones hit 3 AWS centers in Bahrain and in the UAE. And that attack was believed to have been the first time, at least confirmed, that a military power and military has fired on basically data centers, global cloud services providers. Now, data centers are a big topic on this show. We're talking about these large complexes that house what are popularly known as server farms. All that data processing power is needed so that you can use your cell phones to do all the things that we do in them every day. But they're also vital to military operations around the world. And the use of artificial intelligence means we need a lot more of that data processing power, and as such, a lot more of those data centers. It's one of the reasons that we've talked about on this show before, the idea of putting some on the moon or potentially even in orbit. But this is now a feature of warfare. These things are relied on by not only the U.S. military, but the militaries of our allies. And in a great power war, it's not hard to imagine a scenario where these become targets, whether that's on Earth, in space, in orbit, basically anywhere, because taking them out of commission can really slow down everything that a modern day military is trying to do. And it's hard to protect them all because we can't make enough Patriot missile defense batteries and THAADs and other sort of missile defense interceptors as it is right now to protect all the potential targets in a major power war, let alone all of the data centers we're going to be building now and into the future to fund all of these AI-powered U.S. military capabilities that we're going to have. So this is a big deal right now. It's not getting enough media attention, I think, but Iran certainly realizes strategically the value of these data centers, and that's why right now it's my threat of the week. And with that, thank you, Guy. As always, a huge thanks to Scott Davis for taking us deep inside the world of ground combat systems and the future of them. Most of all, thanks to all of you, our listeners. Please go ahead and hit that subscribe button, share with all your friends, and we will be back next week on the Threat Status Podcast.